Dr. Maha. Good morning, Dr. Maha, again in New York. Actually, to remind you that it's 4 o'clock in the morning there, and we can see that Dr. Maha is having a lot of coffee to keep up with. So we start now, and I remind Dr. Maha is a professor of international relations at New York University. This is just a reminder, and we remind of the title of Dr. Maha's. It is the International Order in Post-COVID-19, the limits of change. So that is related to decoupling, the possibility of, or the non-possibility of decoupling. Dr. Maha, please, good morning to you, and we would like to listen to your talk, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, good morning. I think this is the earliest I've ever been up for a talk, so I'm excited to join you from New York. As mentioned, I'm a professor at NYU. I'm also on the Global Future Council at the World Economic Forum, focused on frontier risk this year, and I have a new book coming out called Global Spring that ties into some of the ideas that I wanted to share. In terms of the international order and where we may be headed, I tend to look at the world through the lens of risk, and that means, or that refers to certain global trends. So I just want to walk through 4 areas of disruption that I think are worth highlighting. And I do tend to, although I think it's important to look at the world through the lens of the state, I think it's also important to look through the lens of society and understand the trends that are building in different regions around the world. I think it's safe to say that before the pandemic even began, in the 2010s, we were already witnessing disruptions in 4 key areas that I feel make up our global legitimacy crisis that is deepening this decade and will likely persist in the next, I believe 50 years is our time frame. So let me go through those 4 points and relate it to a post-pandemic era. First of all, geopolitically, it's safe to say, and the first speaker touched on this, that there is a question mark about the structure of the world order. It's no longer a post-Cold War era, and there's a big question mark even with the, even though it is a post-Trump era, there's still a big question mark whether President Biden has the legitimacy to reposition the US to be the leader of the international system. And what I feel is that it's unlikely we're going to have clarity on that. And a lot of that has to do with, of course, the rise of China. But if you're thinking further into the future, of course, there are other regions that are relevant beyond just a US versus China framework and a tech Cold War. We have to think about perhaps we're just getting deeper into a G0 world, as Ian Bremmer argues in many of his books, that this is just an era of a lack of global leadership, and that will define the coming years and decades. You could also argue that this is simply an era that will become more defined by regions. Maybe the future is African or the future is Asian. I think a longer term framework means we have to consider these other possibilities. In my work, I tend to emphasize the role of the non-state actor, whether it's the these new influencers that are already taking shape on a global stage, the citizen protester, the activist billionaire, the tech firm. So the very nature of how we define power could be evolving as we speak, and certainly will become more relevant to the discussion going forward. And I think if you reflect on the pandemic era and beyond, I think we've been reminded that another aspect of power is to do with COVID-19 diplomacy. As everyone knows, China took the lead early on in terms of not just the Belt Road Initiative, but of course COVID diplomacy. Although now there is a big question mark as to whether the effectiveness of their vaccines and of course the masks. But you've seen the US step up and try to fill that gap as well. So I think that potentially could reshape our bilateral relations, the COVID-19 diplomacy that's taken place. And it hasn't just involved countries like China, it's also involved Cuba, Turkey, and many other countries. So I think the longer term effect of this is unknown. And I think that's something we'll need to keep track of, in addition to, of course, vaccine diplomacy. Secondly, I think another major trend that has manifested itself in the last decade and will continue in the coming years is this question mark about democracy. Is it still the best system, which is what we assumed in a post-Cold War era? What we have observed in the last decade is a citizen challenge to the political status quo. We've observed that even here in the US. I'm sure everyone is familiar with what happened on January 6th and this crisis of democracy that's still in vogue, and similarly across Europe, there's a question mark and many studies to back up this idea that perhaps democracy is not working, and maybe in the future, having a democracy or not will not necessarily be a marker of power, and that we may need to reimagine the social contract within our individual countries, and understand a different relationship between citizen and government going forward. And again, maybe observing a rise of non-state actors, and we've seen it during the pandemic period, democracies, non-democracies. I don't think there's necessarily a trend that shows one or the other has been better at dealing with COVID-19 response. And I think that trend will continue. We should expect more anti-government protests and more challenges to the political status quo. Thirdly, economically, we are all aware that globalization has had a challenger for a while, first from citizen protesters and more recently from economic nationalism. How will that dynamic play out in the coming decade and beyond? Related to that, there's a big question mark about how the nature of our work is going to change. Who are we in relation to our work? As we get deeper into a tech-driven world order, there will be a lot of unemployment on top of the unemployment associated with the pandemic that I'm not sure governments have a handle on. And we're likely going to see this emergent social class everywhere of precariats, people who have no job security and have perhaps lost their occupational identity crisis. And it bleeds into a larger mental health crisis if we have more people who are falling through the cracks economically. Do we need a new moral economy, a new social contract with regards to our work? I think that question mark has come up in this COVID era and will continue in a post-pandemic era as well.
Dr. Maha, is that in the United States, or you speak about like globally in general?
Sure. I feel to a certain extent it's a global phenomena. I'm not as familiar with, I guess it's a different question mark in the Arab region, but I think most governments have offered relief packages that have still, unfortunately, seen many citizens fall through the cracks. Unemployment, now we're talking about an inflation crisis, hunger crisis. If you throw in the climate crisis, the effect of that, and ongoing pandemic relief, even when the pandemic is over, I think we're going to have the level of frustration in most countries is going to be elevated unless there's some sort of intervention, which at this stage, I don't see any political visionary in most parts of the world. I feel we're lacking in global leadership. And my last point was to do with society. I think everyone is aware that in the 2010s, we've seen a rise of xenophobia, an evolution of extremism, Islamist extremism, far-right extremism, Hindu extremism, Buddhist extremism. It's very sad to have observed this. And I think the pandemic period has reminded us that there's also this rise in East Asian backlash in some countries, particularly Europe and here in the US, given the perceived origins of the virus. And I think this, I'm not sure there's a clear counter narrative to the hate. And again, because of the lack of global leadership and a lack of consensus about what our shared global values are, I feel in the coming decades, this is just going to get worse. And I think it sort of leads to this larger question, are we globalists or nationalists? Do we care about the other? I think that question within society and as a global community will persist in a post-pandemic era as well. And again, there's no leadership or direct conversation about this. At this stage, the only leader I've heard talk about this explicitly is Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand. But to what extent that will translate into significant change going forward, I think that's a separate issue. But that's how I see it. These are the four areas of our global legitimacy crisis. This crisis of values, the status quo, politically, economically, geopolitically, that I think there's no clear response to, and I think it'll likely deepen in the coming decade and be a destabilizing factor for our international order.
A grim picture of international affairs, very pessimistic. How come that the title of your book is Global Spring? I mean, that spring, there are 42 million death cases in America alone. Sorry, COVID cases, and 600,000 plus death cases. How can the title be spring? How could you do that?
I guess when I think of a global spring, I think more along the lines of a citizen pushback to government, citizens challenging government about failures, whether it's to do with COVID or dealing with automation-related unemployment in the future. This crisis of governance that will lead to a rise in citizen frustration. And I think it will, and it has already emerged, the rise of the non-state actor. We have seen even during the pandemic period, other types of actors step up when governments have fallen short. And that's really how I'm envisioning a global spring, more involvement of the non-state actor to fill the gap left by government, whether it's, as I said, the activist citizen, or as we've seen during the pandemic period, and as we'll continue to see, activist billionaires, millionaires are trying to tackle a lot of these global challenges that are shaping the international order. So global spring it's not necessarily positive. It reflects a decline in political legitimacy of governments, but it creates an opportunity for non-state actors.
Oh, thank you very much. This is interesting. We have to come back to the private citizens or non-governmental organizations, the role of women and youth. That's what you are focusing on, kids, and this is going to be the end of the discussion. Dr. Maha, I have been living in China for the past 6 years, and there is a similarity between China and the Gulf states, especially the United Arab Emirates, in empowering women. Women have a very vital and important role in all aspects of life, increasingly decision makers. And that, how do you see the role of women in world affairs, in global affairs, let's say in 20, 30 years?
That's a great question. I mean, I think countries that embrace or promote women in their local economies will obviously be doing better. I think it's safe to say we need more female leaders in politics as well. I mean, early on in the pandemic, there was speculation that the countries with female leaders were performing better to handle the pandemic. Obviously, the situation has evolved since then. But related to that, just going back to what was discussed earlier, I think the question posed was to do with the most successful country in the future. And I think one point that we haven't really dug into is to do with how the nature of power is going to change. And it's not just about who wins the tech Cold War, but also to do with which country has the best AI weaponry. I think many countries already have speculated that the country with the best AI weaponry will likely be the leader of, or the ruler of the world, to quote Putin and others as well. And perhaps that's why we see that a lot of techies have petitioned for an AI weapons treaty to kind of get ahead of this. But I think that aspect of power may be the game changer in the next 50 years, the country with the best AI weaponry. And related to that, another point that hasn't come up too much today in our discussion is to do with the climate crisis. I think everyone is aware that we are in a dangerous period. The UN has said this is a make or break year for us to really make a significant change. And it helps that President Biden is in office and rejoined the Paris Agreement, but it could also be too late. I think the most successful country in the future that could be a leading power in the next 50 years is the one that comes up with the solution to handle the climate crisis and to overcome this. Or the country that manages to leverage its resources. And I think somebody touched on Afghanistan and the Taliban. Obviously, this is a very sensitive situation to have an extremist group leading this very sensitive country, given its geopolitical position. But it also is a country with a lot of natural resources. In the future, as we face a larger resource crunch, are we going to have to engage with countries like Afghanistan? And will that give them legitimacy on a global stage? I think that's an interesting development that we'll have to observe. But yeah, AI weaponry, who handles the climate crisis best or comes up with the solution, and certainly the role of women that will elevate local economies and the global economy as well, as we navigate a post-pandemic era.
Thank you. With regard to post-pandemic era, Dr. Chung